Hey guys, welcome. My name's Andrew. Today we're going to talk a little bit about unit testing in Unity. There's a couple of reasons why you go about writing tests for your games. I think first and foremost, one is to find any bugs that may have been introduced by you changing the software. So if you write your tests, you can rerun those tests again to make sure that you haven't broken anything. It means you'll probably find bugs early, which is great, and means that your game can be fully tested and of a high quality before you release it, which is great. And the other thing I think it does is it actually makes you a better coder. It forces you to abide by what are called solid principles. I'll leave a link down below as to what I mean by solid principles that you can read up on. I've also left a link down below about which is another video from another guy who's sort of done an introduction to unit testing. Check that one out. This is based on a lot of that. I have my own little sort of flavour of it, but that could also be useful. All right. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the content or if you find it helpful. Alright, let's get into it. Okay, so we have a sample scene here. I'm just going to go through what's in the scene. We've got a camera, directional light. We have a player object. We have a target position, and we have a player mover. All that happens if I press the play button is that the player object will move to the top of the screen. So what we want to do is test that this functionality works as expected. Okay. So let's go through each of the objects just quickly so we know what we're talking about. We have a player object in the scene, which is also a prefab. So you see down here it's a prefab. One thing worth pointing out is that the move velocity, so the rate at which the player moves, is 0 in the prefab, but in the scene I've set it to 1, and that's what makes it move. Okay. If we quickly look at that script just to see what we're actually testing, so it's a player movement script. It has an action that gets fired when the target gets reached. It has a move velocity, so that's how fast it's actually moving. It has a target position, which is the position that it'll end up in. And it also has a couple of flags which set whether the target's been reached and whether the object's actually started moving. It's got an awake implementation where we're trying to find that target position to move to. I've put this in purposely as a find object of type so that we can find out how we go and test that later on. It's got a start moving method which actually starts moving, and then the movement logic here. The target position object is just a simple mono behavior. The only reason why I've made it a component is so that we can show you how to add components when we test and find them using that find object of type. And then this player mover, which we're not going to test, it's just in the scene so that we can show how the game actually runs. Okay, so let's get kicked off with starting our setting up our tests. So the first thing I do is that I will create what's called a test assembly folder. So that's under create testing test assembly folder. Click that one and I just take the default, which is tests. Now immediately what will happen is under the test environment you'll get a test assembly. So this is all of the scripts will be referenced under here for testing. Okay, so let's go and create our first test. Alright, so we hit the create and it's going to be under testing C# test script, and I'm going to call it player movement test. Okay, now I've already created this test elsewhere, so you don't have to see me go and type it all out. So let's go and edit it. It will generally, Visual Studio will say that the project's been modified. Just hit the reload button, that's fine. And it'll give you a couple of methods to start with. One is the player movement, one is the simple pass test, which is just essentially running a particular piece of logic and returning. It'll also give you this unity test, which is a bit more complicated, but it allows you to wait for certain processes to happen. So, for example, in our case, moving from one place to another. I'm just going to go and grab the one that I've created earlier. Okay, and I'm going to paste that in here. Okay, so I've got this player movement tests. Oh, I've actually called it test. So let's just make it test. Now, the first thing you want to notice is, and I'll go through everything, but the first thing we've noticed is we've got a compile error here. So what's happening is it's trying to reference the player movement script that I showed you, so this one here, but it can't find it. Why is that? The reason why is because the test assembly doesn't know about our scripts that we've created. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into Unity and we're actually going to create a test assembly, sorry, an assembly definition for our game scripts. So I'm just going to call that the name of this project, unit test tutorial. Okay. And that will then basically encapsulate all of the scripts that we have within this folder or subfolders for the Unity assembly definition. It's not just Unity, it's any kind of assembly definition. Right, so now what I want to do is actually reference those in our test. So if I click this assembly definition, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of stuff. The one we're interested in is the assembly definition reference. So we're just going to add a new one, and we're going to call it, or we're going to look up the one that we just created, unit test tutorial. There it is there. And then we're going to hit the apply button. Okay. Alright, it's going to do its thing, and if we go back to our tutorial, it'll ask us again to reload. Hit the reload button, and you'll see now we're actually referencing that script. Okay, so that's quite important. But let's go through this test. So first thing I've got is this player prefab path, and if we go into our back to Unity, we can see we've got prefabs and we've got our player prefab. Now I've just noticed that I've called it player object.prefab, so let's make sure we have the right path there. Okay, so that will that's the path to our prefab that we're going to load up and set values on. I've also got a couple of scene objects that I'm going to create. So I'm going to mock this player object. So that's that little cube that moves. We're going to mock a camera so we can see it move. We're going to mock the target position, which is the position it's going to move to. And we're also going to mock the, we're actually going to create the player movement component, which we'll be testing. So there's a couple of methods that I've created here. So the first one is you can use something called a setup method. I'm pretty sure this gets run each time you run the test or tests within your script here. So just be careful. So if you're setting up things, they might get set up twice. Just need to check that. I'm not 100% sure. But anyway, what it does is it gets run before your test. That's why it's called setup. So there's a couple of little tricks in here that I'm doing. So the first one is I've got this mock target position. This is the position that the player is going to move to. I just create a simple new game object. I'm calling it a target position. And then I'm setting the position to be 5 units high. So that's what it's going to move to. Then I'm adding a component called target position. So if you remember back to our player movement script, this is the one that it's going to pick up. It's going to try and find an object in the scene that's called target position. And luckily we've created that right here. The second thing is I'm going to load up that prefab. Okay, so that's that prefab, the actual player prefab, and I'm going to instantiate that object so that it'll get created in the scene. I've then done a similar thing as the target position, but for the camera. So I've made a camera, I've added the camera component, I've set its position to be 10 units in the Z direction back so we can see it, and then I've told it to look at the player object player object's position. And now I'm actually creating the component that I want to test. So on that mock player object that I created from the prefab, it's got a player component on it, a player movement component. Okay, so that's that one. And remember, its move velocity is 0. So how do we go about testing that? How do we go about actually setting this serialized field? Okay, so I've got a little trick that I use, which is a method that uses reflection. So I've got a component, any kind of game component, as an input. I've got a string, which is the field name, and I've also got the value that I want to set on that field. So it uses something called reflection, where it gets the component type, finds the field that we've specified as a non-public instance. Okay. Now we're just checking that that property is not null. If it is, then we'll throw an exception. If it is there, then we'll set the value that we're trying to put in on the component. Okay, so that's a really nice little method to have. You can split that out to a different class or a little helper method, so you can use it for the rest of your tests. Okay, so that's the set private field capability there. And then there's the actual test method that gets run. Okay, so I've got a flag here that indicates whether I've reached the target. I'm setting up the callback on that target, so that's that callback at the top there for player movement, and I'm telling it that once it reaches the target, to set that target reach to be true. Then I've told the player movement component to start moving, and while the target hasn't been reached, it'll start printing out a method. And here it'll start printing out a log message. And then once, what it'll do is it'll actually wait for a second each time. So it's just waiting there until the target reached becomes true. And then once it's true, I've just added a little assert to make sure that it's true before we leave the method. Okay, so that's all it does. So let's go and see it in action. Oh, sorry, there's one other thing, and that is that I've got a little tear down method. So this method gets fired, I think, after each run of the script as well, that will then go and destroy any objects that I've created in the scene. So I've just realized I've missed a object, so I'm just going to add that in there just quickly. I think you can pretty much use object instead of game object as well there. So anyway, let's go back to our game. We're going to go to our test runner and we're going to run that test. As you can see, it goes to the top of the screen, which is where we put the target, and then the test finishes. So that's it, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Any questions, comments, let me know.